Most of you know that there is a 7-year lawsuit that was happening in California. It's a lawsuit against the EPA, and this next speaker, in my opinion, single-handedly really put a whooping on him if you watched it all over the years. I first met Michael about 11 years ago. He came to my office, and we filmed a public service video basically imploring the FDA to do their job and take all the fluoride supplements off the shelves because they've never been approved. I don't know if you remember when we did, okay. And anyway, so let's go to the real specifics. He is a partner at Siri and Glimstad. He represents individuals harmed by corporate negligence, misguided medical practices, and overreaching government mandates. We've got a little thing going here. Michael has been investigating fluoride issues for over 20 years and served as lead attorney for the plaintiffs in the Food and Water Watch v. Environmental Protection Agency, this court case that he's about to discuss in detail. He received his law degree, magna cum laude, from Temple Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the Temple Law Review. My good friend, Michael Connett.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I guess before I begin, I've been asked just to make a pretty basic disclaimer, which is that I am the lead attorney in this case. And being the lead attorney, I obviously have an interest in this case. So I want to talk to you about this lawsuit that we just trying to see. Where do I point this thing? Right here. Oh, right here. Point right here. Okay. Oh, we figured it out.
We did it.
We did it. Right up to next.
I didn't remember we had one phone doing it back in. Oh, you know what?
Okay, well, so let's start here. So 8 years ago, we filed a petition with the EPA. You can see here, this is the cover page of the petition, and we asked the EPA to exercise its authority under the Toxic Substances Control Act to ban the addition of fluoride chemicals to drinking water on the grounds that this practice poses an unreasonable risk to the brain, okay? Toxic Substances Control Act, sometimes referred to as TSCA. IAOMT was a petitioner when we started, and when we filed this petition, we literally brought like 7 boxes of over 300 studies to the EPA headquarters in DC, and it was a pretty cool day. So why did we file this under TSCA? Why did we file this under TSCA? Well, we had been trying for years to get the attention of another office at the EPA, the Office of Water. And that was like banging our heads against the wall. So what we decided to do is to file this petition with a separate office that operates an entirely separate law, TSCA. And TSCA gives the EPA the authority to ban the particular use of a chemical if it poses an unreasonable risk. But that's not what makes TSCA so powerful. As you can see here, the courts have recognized that TSCA is an unusually powerful procedure to force EPA's hand. It's an incredible statute passed in 1976. Why is it powerful? It's powerful because typically when you challenge a federal agency on any matter dealing with science, okay, the courts are extremely deferential to the agency because the agency is the expert. Who's the court to second guess the expert judgment of a federal agency? Now you may have heard recently about the Supreme Court decision overturning Chevron deference. To be clear, that does not apply here. Chevron deference is about interpretation of law. Here we're dealing with scientific analysis. And when you typically challenge a federal agency, unless it's 2 + 2 = 5, unless the agency has made such a blatant error, a court's very rarely going to agree with you and side against the agency. What TSCA does is it says the citizens are entitled to a de novo proceeding. Now that's legal gobbledygook. What is de novo proceeding? De novo proceeding means the court cannot defer to the judgment of the agency. The court has to provide an independent assessment. And that's exactly what we've been wanting on the fluoride issue. And courts have recognized that this powerful procedure is a way to counter bureaucratic lethargy. Bureaucratic lethargy that undermines the vital authority that EPA has to protect the public. And that is designed for fluoride, okay? Because with fluoride in the EPA, it's far worse than bureaucratic lethargy, okay? It is far worse than bureaucratic lethargy that has got us where we are. So our lawsuit was focused on the neurodevelopmental effects of fluoride, but what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna start by telling you a little bit about the background of EPA safety standard for fluoride. What is it based on? What is EPA safety standard for fluoride based on? Well, you have to go back to 1985. And the EPA established the safe drinking water level for fluoride, called the Maximum Contaminant Level Goal, MCLG, okay? The MCLG is a purely health-based standard. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA needs to set the MCLG at a level that protects not only against known effects, but against all reasonably anticipated effects, okay? And in considering this, the agency cannot consider things like costs or feasibility, okay? That's for the other standard called the MCL, which is the binding standard on the communities. MCLG is the pure science, pure health-based analysis. So if you're a scientist and you really want to engage in pristine science, unsullied by politics, the MCLG is your jam, because this is where science rules, or where science should rule. So, what did EPA, for the MCLG, this purely health-based standard, what did the EPA base the MCLG on? What health effect of fluoride did it seek to protect? A condition called crippling skeletal fluorosis, and you can see the picture there of two men who have it. Crippling skeletal fluorosis is sometimes referred to as stage 3 skeletal fluorosis. When you have stage 3 crippling skeletal fluorosis, you are in real trouble. You have overt systemic poisoning. And so let's look at how the federal government has defined crippling skeletal fluorosis. This is from a deposition I did in the case. Crippling fluorosis produces limitation of joint movement, calcification of ligaments, neck, vertebrae column, crippling deformities of the spine and major joints, muscle wasting, neurologic defects, and compression of the spinal cord. That is crippling fluorosis. Now, the EPA determined that crippling skeletal fluorosis is the most sensitive effect of fluoride exposure. It's the critical effect. What that means is, as you increase the dose of fluoride, EPA says the first adverse effect that you will encounter is crippling fluorosis. In my deposition here of the EPA scientist Ed Ohanian, I said, so according to EPA, the first adverse effect that can occur to the human organism from fluoride exposure is crippling skeletal fluorosis. Correct. That's what the standard is based on. Now, so what that means is, under EPA safe safety standard, until you have this condition right here, you cannot have been harmed by fluoride. Any exposure to fluoride that does not cause that condition under EPA's MCLG, under the safety standard, is a safe exposure, okay? And the EPA set this standard, the MCLG, at 4 parts per million, 4 parts per million in the water. To put that in perspective, at the time EPA set that standard, the optimal level of fluoride that we add to drinking water for fluoridation was 1 part per million. So the MCLG was 4 times higher than the so-called optimal. So let's look at stage 2 skeletal fluorosis. This is the clinical disease that precedes the crippling phase. And just to be clear, I asked Dr. Ohanian, senior scientist at EPA, who is appearing as a representative for the agency in this case. I go, so EPA's MCLG was designed to prevent phase 3 crippling fluorosis, right? Correct. But not to prevent clinical phase 2, right? Answer, correct. So here, Dr. Ohanian, I'm going to talk about with him, this is the EPA representative, what stage 2 skeletal fluorosis is.
EPA has defined stage 2 skeletal fluorosis as characterized by sporadic pain, stiffness of the joints, and osteosclerosis of the pelvis and spine, calcification of the ligaments, and at times osteoporosis of the long bones, correct?
Correct.
And as we discussed earlier, EPA did not consider stage 2 skeletal fluorosis to be an adverse health effect when it established the MCLG in 1985, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So stage 2 skeletal fluorosis is joint pain, calcification of the ligaments, osteosclerosis, and osteoporosis. According to EPA safety water standard, you can suffer all of those effects, but that won't be adverse to your health. Those are not adverse effects under the safety standard. Perfectly acceptable under the MCLG for a person to have osteosclerosis or osteoporosis or chronic joint pain as a result of fluoride from drinking water. So here, Dr. William Hersey, who you see here, was a scientist at EPA for many years and was very critical of the agency's handling of fluoride. And here, in an exercise of the obvious, I asked Dr. Hersey for his opinion on whether crippling fluorosis is the most sensitive effect of fluoride exposure.
Do you have any opinion, based on what you learned about fluoride, as to whether crippling skeletal fluorosis is appropriately considered the most sensitive effect of fluoride exposure?
Yes, I do have an opinion, and it's not the most sensitive effect.
And what do you base that on?
A plethora of research on effects on other tissues beside connective tissue, especially on the developing brain.
What if we just limit the question to the skeleton, the bones? Do you think crippling skeletal fluorosis is appropriately considered the most sensitive skeletal effect of fluoride?
Objection Foundation.
Now, common sense says it can't be. I mean, you don't wake up one day and your spine is fused. I mean, there are aches and pains that develop as your connective tissue becomes more and more calcified, more and more inflexible. And those kinds of arthritic type symptoms clearly are adverse health effects. So, yeah, it's crippling. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly your spine is fused and say, oops, I had too much fluoride.
So here's another effect of fluoride exposure that EPA was perfectly aware of and was considering in the 1980s. It's a condition called severe dental fluorosis. There is no dispute whatsoever that 4 ppm fluoride, the MCLG, will cause this condition in many children. No dispute. EPA will not dispute that. Nobody will dispute that. But the good news is The EPA said this is not an adverse effect on human health. Okay, not an adverse effect. Imagine if you had teeth that looked like that. Imagine if you were a teenager smiling in front of your peers. What would that do to your self-esteem? What would that do to your sense, there's a lot of impacts that come when people are really embarrassed about their appearance. And EPA completely disregarded that aspect of this issue. But it's not just the embarrassment and the social anxiety that comes from this, but severe dental fluorosis is a condition where it's a mineralization defect that causes extreme porosity of the enamel. And so the enamel begins to pit and crumble. And here is Dr. Joyce Donahue, who is the senior scientist in EPA's Office of Water, and she's been EPA's main expert on fluoride since the 1990s. So I asked her about what is severe dental fluorosis.
In severe dental fluorosis, the porosity of the enamel is so severe that the enamel begins to pit and crumble, right?
That's the definition that's been accepted as the definition, that's when it becomes severe.
You would agree that a child, adolescent, let's say an adolescent in high school, if they had extensive black staining of their front two teeth, that could cause pretty severe embarrassment with their peers. Would you agree with that?
What they would do would be avoid letting people see their teeth. Right.
So, yeah, we'll just let them avoid showing their teeth to people.
In severe dental fluorosis,
This is Paul Price. Paul Price was the EPA employee who wrote the standard. He wrote the MCLG standard in 1985. So if you read the Federal Register document, which explains why severe dental fluorosis is not a health effect, this guy wrote it, okay? He also wrote something else that wasn't in the Federal Register, that the public didn't see. And that was, he wrote a mock press release about the standard, which he circulated to other scientists at EPA. And in his mock press release, Dr. Price says, these teeth are gross enough to gag a maggot, okay? And he also said something else, which I talk about here with him.
going back to the press release or the mock press release that you wrote, the last sentence of it reads, EPA selected this level based upon a cost-effectiveness study which showed that it is cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride. That's what you wrote, right?
That's correct.
And what did you mean by it's cheaper for people to keep their mouths shut than to remove the fluoride?
I meant to be funny.
So it was funny to them. It wasn't as funny to people who developed that condition. The teeth gross enough to gag a maggot, not an adverse health effect. So here is a deposition I did with Dr. Robert Carton, who at the time EPA developed that standard, he was the president of the union that represents EPA scientists in Washington, D.C. The union of EPA scientists was incredibly concerned with this MCLG, very concerned, and they did everything they possibly could to raise these concerns with the administration, but they were consistently ignored time and time again, until, feeling they had no other option, they joined a lawsuit filed by an environmental group, Natural Resources Defense Council, against the agency over the crudeness of this standard. An unprecedented act where you have EPA's own scientists going to court to sue their bosses. Not an easy thing to do. The court ultimately denied them the right to do so, but here I asked Dr. Carton why they did it.
You want to support the NRDC in its challenge of the EPA's regulation.
Right.
Farm leading.
Which we didn't want to do. We made many attempts, as we've already shown here, of trying to get the attention of the powers that be and work it out. And they had no interest in it. So that it forced us into finding another avenue, because this is serious business. You're talking about harming the health of lots and lots of people, and making false statements about what actually is a health effect and what isn't a health effect.
So let's
You
summarize
want this-
where we are so far. I asked Dr. Donahue to explain for me the state of science at EPA when she joined the agency in the mid-1990s.
When you first started working at EPA in the 1990s, the EPA did not believe it would be an adverse health effect for a child to develop extensive pitting of the enamel as a result of fluoride exposure, right?
Based on what they wrote at that time.
Okay. And the EPA did not believe it would be an adverse health effect for a person to suffer chronic joint pain from fluoride exposure so long as they were not crippled, right?
By the definition of crippling skeletal fluorosis, one can, again, based on what was written, it would appear they did not.
Chronic joint pain, okay. Now, how would you feel if you got chronic joint pain from just drinking your water? Not an adverse health effect. Don't worry about it. So let's go to 2006. A very significant development occurred. In the early 2000s, the EPA went to the National Research Council, which is part of the National Academy of Science, and asked the National Research Council to review the toxicologic literature on fluoride. It took 3 years, but in 2006, the NRC released its report. It's the most comprehensive assessment of the toxicology of fluoride ever written, okay? And it was a very important report on a number of fronts. First, they concluded, little surprise here, but that the MCLG is unsafe. It's too high. It needs to be lowered, point blank. Too high, needs to be lowered, okay? What do they base that on? Principally the fact that severe dental fluorosis is an adverse health effect, okay, 1, and 2, that fluoride causes damage to the bones before it causes crippling fluorosis. So the NRC agreed with that. That's what the EPA scientists, the union scientists, were saying back in the 1980s. The NRC endorsed that, okay? So that was a good development, right? But the NRC also went beyond that. The NRC's report identified a range of potential effects that fluoride may have on the body, on the endocrine system, particularly the thyroid gland, also the pineal gland, effects on blood sugar, potential effects on diabetes, a lot of endocrine effects, but also effects on the neurological system, on the brain. And so we talked, this is an adverse health effect now. And so here is the conclusion of the NRC, that it is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. And they based that on principally on animal studies that were available at the time. There were also some human studies available which were linking fluoride to reduced IQ. The studies were not yet of a methodological quality to make any confident conclusions about, but the NRC was concerned about them nevertheless and recommended a lot of research to be done on brain, thyroid, a lot of health effects. Here is a deposition that I took in this case, okay? One of the great things about this case is I was able to depose the Centers for Disease Control through what is called a 30B6 deposition. 30B6 deposition is a sort of legal sort of idea that when you want to depose an organization, like a big corporation, okay? Last week I deposed GSK, a 30B6 of GSK. You want to depose an organization, right? Well, you can't just go to an organization and say, knock, 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 can you tell me the answer to this? You have to have a human being, right? Well, 30B6 is the corporation or the government agency sort of manifest into a human body, and when they speak, it's the equivalent of the agency speaking through their mouths. So Casey Hannon was identified to answer questions about the CDC's understanding of fluoride's health effects. And I asked him about NRC's findings on the brain. So let's see what he said.
So the NRC found that lipids and phospholipids and protein content have been shown to be reduced in the brains of laboratory animals subsequent to fluoride exposure. Correct?
That's what they're saying here, yes.
And the CDC agrees with that finding.
Yes, as a summary of the hazard.
You see the next section of on this page is titled Anatomical Changes in the Brain.
Yes.
And it begins, studies of rats exposed to sodium fluoride or aluminum fluoride have reported distortion in cells in the outer and inner layers of the neocortex. Neuronal deformations were also found in the hippocampus and to a smaller extent in the amygdala and the cerebellum. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with that finding as a summary of the hazard.
As it relates to rat studies, yes.
Okay. And you see the next highlighted portion in that paragraph?
I do.
It reads, the substantial enhancement of reactive microglia, the presence of stained intracellular neurofilaments, and the presence of IgM observed in rodents are related to signs of dementia in humans. The magnitude of the changes was large and consistent among the studies. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And CDC agrees with the NRC that this is a correct summary of the hazard.
Correct.
Now, those kind of statements typically don't find their way into CDC press releases about fluoridation. But just so you know, they're not disputing that this stuff will affect the brain at a certain dose. So, it's been 18 years since the NRC told the EPA that the MCLG is too high, it's unsafe, and needs to be lowered. What has the EPA done? Nothing. They haven't changed the standard. The current safety standard, the MCLG, is still 4 parts per million in this country. So I asked Dr. Donahue, the fluoride expert at EPA's Office of Water, about this. And I think look at her body language as I ask her whether she agrees it's a crude standard.
The MCLG for fluoride in the United States is still the same exact level that it was when the EPA set it in 1985, right?
That is a statement of fact.
So the MCLG that we still have in place for fluoride, the year 2019, is a pretty crude standard.
It's an out-of-date assessment.
She at least gave me out-of-date assessment, okay? But they're not, I think it's fair to say that EPA is not boasting about this standard, right? There is one thing the EPA has done since the NRC's findings, okay? One change that they've made. It hasn't had any effect on any policy, hasn't changed their water standard, but scientifically, it's a development, okay? In 2010, the EPA did a risk assessment where they identified severe dental fluorosis as the most sensitive effect. So they moved away from crippling fluorosis, okay? They accept that severe dental fluorosis is adverse, and then they calculated a reference dose for the level of fluoride that causes the effect, okay? The reference dose is essentially the acceptable dose, and if you exceed it, you're at risk of the effect, okay? And EPA set, this is gonna be wonky, but EPA set the reference dose at 0.08 milligrams per kilogram per day, okay? And despite the fact that almost everybody who lives in a 4 ppm area exceeds that dose, virtually everybody, as we've noted, the EPA hasn't changed that standard. But that's not the biggest problem. That's not the biggest problem with this standard, okay? Because now we're gonna talk about EPA's Achilles heel. EPA's Achilles heel on the fluoride issue, which we were able to get and take them on in this case, okay? We're able to take them on in this case, on their Achilles heel. And that is, this whole reference dose and the way the EPA has approached fluoride from the beginning is in complete violation of their own risk assessment procedures. They've never applied their risk assessment protocols to fluoride. It's a double standard, it's obvious, it's been there from day one, and we were able to show that in this case, as we'll talk about. But one of the sort of, to sum it up, the major violation of EPA's approach to fluoride is they refuse to implement a margin of safety, okay? Margin of safety. So I will attempt to just briefly explain this concept, and that is that when you're doing a risk assessment, you start by identifying the hazard level, okay? The hazard level, which is the dose or the exposure level that's associated, where you can observe the harm, okay? You can observe the harm. And after EPA identifies that hazard level, it implements a safety factor, okay? Sometimes called an uncertainty factor, so that the acceptable dose, there's a buffer from the hazard level to the exposure level. Because you don't want to set the acceptable dose like a hair below the hazard level, right? You need to have some margin, a buffer, so that you're protecting everybody in the population. And you're also always acting on incomplete information, so you never really know where the threshold is. You want to protect people from that, right? One of the bases for a margin of safety is what's called intraspecies variation, human-to-human variation. One size does not fit all when we're talking about chemicals, right? We all respond differently to one and the same drug or chemical. Like think about beer or wine. Someone can drink 1 glass and they're drunk. Someone can drink 6 and they're fine, right? Same thing with all toxics. EPA's never, ever implemented an uncertainty factor to protect for variation in the population, ever. They didn't do it here with their risk assessment, 2010. But there's another basis that EPA can use for a safety factor. It's called a database uncertainty factor. And this is getting wonky, and I apologize, okay? But a database uncertainty factor, the premise of it is, say you're regulating against severe dental fluorosis, right? But you know and have reason to believe that the chemical can also cause other effects, right? But you don't have great dose response data yet for those other effects, okay? But you kind of believe they're going on. Well, in that situation, you can implement a margin of safety to protect against those other effects for which you have concern, okay? Database uncertainty factor. So what did EPA do in this 2010 risk assessment, okay? What did they do? Well, they said there's no need for a database uncertainty factor because the database for fluoride is complete. Complete. And they based that on the National Research Council's report from 2006, which had identified many risks and hazards from fluoride that we needed more information on. And there was neurodevelopmental effects and thyroid effects and you name it. It was that the whole report is chock full of red flags. But EPA looked at that report and said, database is complete, no reason to protect against other potential harms of fluoride. When I read that in 2010, I was like, that's just preposterous, right? And I suspected something, right? Something that my father, who I've worked with on fluoride, a toxicologist, he suspected it for a long time. I've suspected it for a long time. Never been in writing. But that this is a pretext. It's not really what EPA thought, okay? What really is guiding this, we've always suspected, is that you can't implement a margin of safety for fluoride and keep water fluoridation. Because your dose, the margin is already so, like 0.08 milligrams per kilogram per day, is a tad higher than the so-called optimal dose, which is 0.05, okay? So if you implement a margin of safety, boom, you are below the optimal level that's used to protect against tooth decay, right? So EPA is like, oops, can't implement a margin of safety because we're going to interfere with the fluoridation program. But they've never said that. They always come up with pretexts like this until until this lawsuit. Because this guy right here is Ed Ohanian, and the EPA identified him as the voice of the agency to explain to me the basis for this reference dose. So this is EPA speaking through this guy, okay? So I asked him, what was the basis of the standard? So let's hear what he has to say. Warning, little wonky, okay? So the EPA loves making this stuff confusing. They don't like to speak in simple language, but I'm gonna break it down, okay? Because this is a significant admission.
Let's now turn to what the EPA did and what the EPA concluded with its risk assessment. The EPA established a reference dose for fluoride of 0.08 milligrams per kilogram per day, correct?
Correct.
And the EPA concluded that that is safe for the entire population, children and adults, correct?
It was based on actually dental fluorosis to begin with, from 1942 study.
1942 study, cutting edge science.
And that's pretty much, we used it, and we felt that also might be protective of some of the other adverse health effects, which are fluorosis and bone fractures.
What database uncertainty factor did EPA use for this risk assessment?
Well, may I just take a step back? You are dealing with a situation with a chemical that also has adequate level that the Institute of Medicine came back to us with. That means that the level might be needed for to prevent dental cavities and for bone health. When you take that, and it's not only with fluoride, with some other chemicals too, you remember them, when there's some essentiality or adequate level that involved, you cannot come up with something which is going to be lower than that particular level. The level that Institute of Medicine came up with in 1915
He meant
was
1997.
0.05 milligram per kilogram per day. Now, if you take 0.08 and you added another safety factor, that would have been lower than your 0.05, and that doesn't work.
Okay. So let me see if I...
There, he just volunteered, and I'm like, I think he just gave me the admission I was looking for, and I haven't even asked him that yet, right? So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna break this down. I'm like, okay, I just wanna make sure that we're gonna be like on the same page here so the EPA can't wiggle out of this, so I start breaking it down. Oh.
Let's now turn to what the...
If you go to 2, it should work. 2 minutes.
The level might be needed for to prevent dental cavities and for bone health. When you take that, and it's not only with fluoride, with some other chemicals too, you remember them.
Okay, well, we'll just skip that one. But basically what he ended up saying in this clip, okay, he confirmed that yes, you cannot implement a margin of safety because it will take you below the level that you need for caries prevention, okay? And I confirmed that with him multiple times, and he kept giving it to me, and I was like, yes, okay? Like, he's like completely contradicting what the risk assessment says. Nowhere in that risk assessment does EPA ever say that the reason we have this very high reference dose is because you can't have a margin of safety because it will interfere with fluoridation and caries prevention. Never would they say that, and they never said that, but that's what he said in the deposition. Completely contradicts the whole premise of current fluoride safety standards right there. And then he went a step further than that. I go, sir, would you agree that if you look at the NRC's data on neurotoxicity, that there was a justification for implementing a database uncertainty factor, okay? And he said yes. So at that time, in 2006, they already had enough information on neurotoxicity to implement a safety factor to protect people from this foreseeable risk, okay? So that's the real reason why we have such a high safety standard. They can't use risk assessment procedures because it will interfere with water fluoridation. And water fluoridation is the trump card. EPA has always kowtowed to the dental interests, the dental lobby. It's never been prepared to exercise its own expertise on risk assessment until now. That's why TSCA is so powerful, because we forced EPA's hand in this case because they couldn't rely on that crap. They had to do risk assessment in this case, in our trial. So, we had our first trial in this case in June of 2020. It came after tons of depositions. We had over 20 depositions, tons of discovery. We got lots of documents from EPA. We had a lot of expert discovery. And this was the first time ever in the 40-plus years of the Toxic Substances Control Act that a citizen group has taken a petition under TSCA to a trial. This is the first trial ever under TSCA. Never been done before. So one of the things that drove EPA bonkers, because you know they love talking about teeth and teeth and teeth and teeth and teeth and teeth. And you guys are dentists, you guys talk about teeth too, but you know, like they love talking about teeth, right? Don't talk about hazards, talk about teeth. Well, guess what? The judge, looking at the statutory language, which says you cannot consider non-risk factors, you gotta just look at the hazards. The judge threw out all discussion of teeth from the case. So now we are like, let's just treat fluoride as the toxic substance it is. Let's look at what the risk level is. You can have your discussion about benefits for another day, but let's have a sober, clear analysis of the hazard level and the risk level, and that's what we did. We got some good admissions in this case. I'm going to talk about a couple right now. Now, for any of you who are familiar with the fluoridation debate, and I'm sorry if you are, one of the things you typically hear at town halls from dentists who know very little about the issue is there are thousands upon thousands, 30,000 studies that have shown that fluoridation is safe. 30,000 studies. The science is settled. Why are we even talking about fluoride? It's the 21st century. This debate was done in the 50s. Thousands of studies, right? Okay. So I go to the EPA and I say, hey, guys, can you show me some of the safety data you got? I'd love to see what you got that you think shows that fluoride's safe for the brain. Okay, let's talk about the brain, okay? Prenatal studies, anything. Just tell me what you got that you think shows that fluoridation is safe for the brain. I also asked the FDA. And I asked the CDC. And I asked all of the fluoridation chemical manufacturers in this country. And, not to leave them out, I asked the National Sanitation Foundation, NSF International, which is this private body that regulates the chemicals that we add to drinking water. I asked all of those organizations, can you point me to a single study? A single study. I'm not talking 30,000, okay? I'm keeping the bar pretty low. One study. Every single organization said the same thing. No, 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 no. We don't have safety data. Oh, I thought there was 30,000 studies which said that this was perfectly safe. 30,000 went to zero pretty quickly once you have the penalty of perjury. So The other thing the EPA admitted is that, like, oh, the MCLG standard, right? You know that standard? Yeah, cannot rely on that for neurotoxicity. We agree that that standard has nothing to do with the brain, and we will not make any representation at any point in this case that that standard somehow suggests that fluoride levels less than 4 ppm are safe for the brain. So we got that out of the way, okay? Now, one of the admissions was placental transfer, which gets to some of the basis for concern for early life fluoride exposure. And it was undisputed in this case that fluoride passes through the placenta and gets into the fetal brain. And there was a lot of testimony in this case, a lot of testimony, exquisite testimony from really top-notch environmental scientists on the vulnerability of the developing brain to toxic substances. And there's two kind of main reasons for that vulnerability. The first is that there is not a well-developed blood-brain barrier until you're about 6 months old. And so before that time, babies that are receiving toxic substances really don't have a way to keep those substances out of their brain, okay? And the other thing is the developing brain is a very rapidly developing system. And when you have an organ that's rapidly developing, it's more vulnerable to harm than a stable, mature system. And so obviously this is a concern when you're adding a chemical to 200 million people's water in the United States because people drink water. And the data show that over 2 million pregnant women live each year in fluoridated areas, okay? Now, just to put this in perspective, EPA under TSCA, the other chemicals they regulate, you're dealing with like sometimes hundreds of people who are exposed, maybe thousands of people who are exposed to the toxic chemical. Here you're dealing with 2 million pregnant women, just, that's a lot of people in comparison to other chemicals that EPA regulates. And over 400,000 exclusively formula-fed babies in fluoridated areas, a major vulnerable population right there, okay? So the experts, and I'll go quickly through this. One of the amazing things about this case is in our case in chief at that trial, I called Dr. Christina Thayer to the stand. She is a director of EPA's Chemical and Pollutant Assessment Division. I called one of their own scientists in our case, which they didn't like too much. And she was a scientist at the National Toxicology Program and had done research on fluoride and the brain in animal studies. And she agreed with us that the animal data supports the biological plausibility of fluoride causing neurotoxic effects in humans. And we had the great fortune in this case of having Dr. Bruce Lanphier and Dr. Howard Hu as experts, and they have been the principal investigators of these birth cohort studies funded by the NIH in Canada and Mexico, which have looked at the relationship between prenatal fluoride exposure and IQ in children. And these studies, which are the highest quality studies to date, have consistently found associations between prenatal exposure and IQ loss. And the testimony at trial went into detail about the strengths of these studies. Extensive vetting from the NIH, extensive peer review, extensive control for potential confounders, individual measurements of fluoride, blinded examinations, and low levels of fluoride, the levels that we add to drinking water. EPA agreed these are the best studies to date, most methodologically reliable studies. Joyce Donahue from the EPA agreed. I called her in our case too, through deposition. I'm not gonna play this clip because I'm running low on time, but Dr. Donahue agreed that these NIH-funded birth cohort studies support the need to really reassess our current safety standards for fluoride. The judge took note of that testimony in his comments.
You would agree that this
we had Philippe Grandjean, one of the world's most preeminent environmental epidemiologists, whose work on mercury formed the basis of EPA standards for mercury exposure, and he testified at trial that the weight of evidence, he looked at the epi data, the animal studies, and concluded that fluoridation does present an unreasonable risk of IQ loss. We had Dr. Kathleen Thiessen, a risk assessment scientist, who applied EPA's risk assessment procedures. You know, those procedures that EPA doesn't like to apply to fluoride, she applied them for them. And she concluded that fluoridation presents an unreasonable risk if we use EPA's standards, okay? So who did EPA call for their experts? This was a gift right here. They called Exponent. Their scientists on the hazards of fluoride came, two of them, Joyce Suji and Ellen Chang, both came from this science for hire, industry-funded organization called Exponent, funded by Dow, Monsanto, American Petroleum Institute, you name any big corporation in this country, they funded Exponent. And they've never studied fluoride before. They only began studying it when they got paid by EPA to do so. So that was nice. They didn't have any subject matter expert on fluoride that they called from EPA. We called their experts on fluoride, not EPA. That was a problem for them. The one expert witness that they called was Tala Hendry, but she wasn't an expert on fluoride. She admitted she'd never read about fluoride before. She was there to talk about procedures and, you know, methodology in general. Now, one of the things that came out, this is the thing, we go back to the very beginning. EPA does not apply its risk assessment procedures to fluoride. And that came through loud and clear, because guess what? They admitted it under oath, live at trial, June 16, 2020, Tala Henry on the stand. Look what she said here. Section 6 is TSCA, okay? You held the plaintiffs to a burden of proof that EPA has not held a single chemical under Section 6 before, correct? By the words on the page, I guess that's true. Okay? Because what EPA held us to, their burden that they wanted us to meet, is you have to prove that 0.7, the exact concentration that you add to water, has already caused harm. You have to prove there's no margin of safety. You just need to show that the human exposure level is hazardous. We don't care about a margin of safety. You need to show that the exposure level is already causing harm. And that's not the way EPA handles any other chemical, ever. So that's their Achilles heel. They cannot deal with margin of safety. And the judge, smart guy, Judge Chen, picked up on that, and he said at the end of the trial, the EPA has used the wrong standard. And he asked EPA, I hope you will go back and look at the evidence again and use the proper standard. Surprise, surprise, EPA declined the offer. The judge also said at the end of the first trial that there is serious evidence here. There's no doubt that these studies from Canada and Mexico raise serious questions. So we're thinking, this is great. We're feeling really good about it. And unfortunately, the judge put the case on hold. Why? Because there was a pending review with the National Toxicology Program, NTP, this federal agency body that was looking at fluoride in the brain. The judge wanted to consider their findings. I understand why the judge would want that, right, to get that input. So we waited. And we waited. And we waited. And then, 2022, a source with knowledge, we waited 2 years, a source with knowledge contacts us. Not someone who's working for the NTP, but someone with knowledge. Told us they've completed the report, they're gonna release it May 18th, 2022. Like, yes, it's here, we're done. May 18th comes, no report. Then we get a word from the same source, it might never ever come out. There's something going on, Okay, I immediately start filing FOIA requests, okay? And sure enough, the FOIA requests confirm that they had set it for May 18, 2022 for publication, right? And then all hell broke loose. The CDC, the NIDCR, the Assistant Secretary of Health came down on NTP and said, there's not a chance that you guys are publishing that on May 18th, okay? And so this is a CDC guy saying, don't know if it's time to call in the big guns from the Office of Director, but I view this report with extreme displeasure. And I'm sure they will too, and they did. And so CDC, this is Tracy Bamer, fluoridation engineer, saying that CDC was in the process of proactively and preemptively taking steps to intervene, and they did. And this is about pushing back hard at the NTP, and they did. And then Assistant Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine, put the kibosh on it, and it didn't come out. So now we're in this waiting mode. I go to the judge, I go, Your Honor, we can't keep waiting for a report that may never come out. This is Brian Baird, Scientific Director of NTP, saying he would not stand for this level of political pressure on the agency. He spoke out very, he had a lot of integrity, Brian Baird. So the judge lifted the case out of the stay, and we go back to round 2, and we have a second trial, and I'm going to skip through the NTP's findings, which are very important, but we don't have time for them. Second trial, and I'm sorry, I did not time this very well, but I will say a few things that happened. First, they agreed, and EPA agreed that neurotoxicity is a hazard of fluoride exposure. They agreed with that. They agree that the NTP report demonstrates under their standards that neurotoxicity is a hazard of fluoride exposure, okay? So we had the hazard piece down, okay? But here's the best part, okay?
You would certainly,
The best part,
Do
and
you
there other
agree-
experts agreed that it was a
do you
hazard.
agree?
We finally got the admission. A simple one, but a long-awaited one. Their expert, Dr. Stanley Barone, I call him the bloviator, he agreed under oath that we need a margin of safety of at least 10 to protect people from fluoride neurotoxicity. First time EPA has ever said that. Margin of safety of 10. To put that in context, the National Toxicology Program's report, which by the way was just released last week, the NTP concluded that above 1.5 parts per million, they have confidence that fluoride lowers IQ, 1.5. So take 1.5 and divide it by 10. What do you got? You got 0.15. Much lower than what we add to water for fluoridation. We add fluoride at 0.7, right? So you can't have a margin of safety on neurotoxin and still have fluoridation, right? But the EPA has now admitted under oath at trial that you do need a margin of safety of 10. So the judge kept pressing the EPA, Stanley Barone, the bloviator, he admitted that something is going on above 2 parts per million. Something is going on above 2 parts per million. And I'm like, so the judge is like, okay, well, then let's apply, the judge was kind of like pushing them, like, well, what do you think, what level can you agree to, right? And EPA's attorneys,
As it stands now.
EPA's attorneys tried to clean this up. And they said, well, Dr. Barone said something's going on above 2 parts per million. But let's be clear. That could be anywhere up to infinity. That could be anywhere up to infinity. No real indication whether it's closer to 2 parts per million or infinity. But that's what they ended the case with. Your Honor, we cannot figure out what that hazard level is. It could be as high as infinity. And that's just not what the evidence showed in this case. The evidence showed, as the NTP report shows, that hazard level is, it's right in that one, it's even, I think there's a lot of evidence, good evidence, that it's less than 1.5, but certainly the NTP said at 1.5 and above, they're confident that there's an effect. So, let's see here. This is the judge pushing us. Can you guys just, EPA, can you give me a level that you will accept the hazard, right? And EPA would not give the court of the level. So I will close by saying the trial ended in February of this year, and we are still awaiting the court's decision. The court has the proverbial hot potato in his hands, and it could come out any day now, the decision from the court. We await it, and that's where things stand. So thank you very much, everybody.